The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Montana Territory, 1874, as Dahlia Reed's trembling hands lowered the smoking revolver. Her husband's killer lay dead at her feet, his blood seeping into the parched earth of what had been their homestead. Tears streamed down her dirt-smeared face as she stared at the burning remnants of the life she and Thomas had built together. "Madam, are you hurt?" The deep voice startled her. Dahlia spun around, pistol raised again, to find a tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. "Stay back," she warned, her voice cracking. "I've already killed one man today." The stranger raised his hand slowly. "No need for more bloodshed. I heard the commotion from the trail. Name's Mason Graves. I'm just passing through." As he stepped closer, she could see his features' clearly weathered skin, kind eyes beneath the brim of a worn cowboy hat, and a face that had seen its share of hardship. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but his gun belt was well maintained. "They killed my husband," Dahlia said, lowering her weapon as exhaustion overtook her. "Burned everything we had." Mason surveyed the destruction, the smoldering cabin, slaughtered livestock, and the lone dead bandit. "Where are the others who did this?" "Rode off. Thomas was already—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "This one stayed behind to finish me off." Mason removed his hat respectfully. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam. You can't stay here tonight. The nearest town is Silver Creek, about 10 miles west. I can escort you there." Dahlia looked back at the ruins of her home, at the fresh mound of earth where she'd hastily buried Thomas. "I can't go back there," she whispered. "Silver Creek is where they came from. Those men, they work for Victor Holcomb. He wanted our land, and Thomas refused to sell." The cowboy followed her gaze across the destroyed homestead, then looked at the darkening sky. "Then we'll ride forward instead," he replied simply. "I'm headed north to Fort Bridger. You're welcome to ride with me until you find someplace safe." "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Mason adjusted his saddle on his bay stallion. "Out here, folks help each other, or they don't survive. Besides," he added with a slight smile that barely touched his eyes, "I've been running from something myself for long enough to recognize when someone needs a fresh start." Dahlia hesitated only briefly before gathering what few possessions remained salvageable. There was nothing left for her here except memories that would haunt her dreams. "I need to retrieve something first," she said, walking to a large oak tree at the edge of the property. Kneeling, she dug with her bare hands until her fingers brushed against metal. She pulled out a small tin box. "Savings," she explained, noting Mason's curious expression. "Thomas always said to keep something hidden away for hard times." A bitter laugh escaped her. "I suppose these qualify." As darkness fell, they rode away from the homestead, Dahlia on her chestnut mare, carrying nothing but a small satchel of belongings, the tin box, and the weight of grief that threatened to crush her. They made camp that night beneath a rocky outcropping that provided shelter from the wind. Mason built a small fire and offered her jerky and hardtack from his provisions. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, as they sat by the fire. Dahlia stared into the flames. "My father had no sons. He taught me instead. Said a woman alone in these territories needed to know how to protect herself." She looked at her hands. "I never thought I'd have to use those lessons." "You did what you had to do," Mason replied. "No judge would fault you for it." "It's not a judge I'm worried about. Holcomb owns half the county and the sheriff with it." Mason nodded grimly. "Men like that are common out here. I've encountered my share." "And what's your story, Mr. Graves? What brings you through these parts?" He poked at the fire. "Just drifting. Spent some years driving cattle from Texas. Did some scouting for the Army. Now, I'm looking for a place that feels right." Dahlia sensed there was more, but she didn't press. Everyone in the West had secrets, herself included. "Get some sleep," Mason said. "I'll take first watch." Dahlia was surprised to find herself drifting off, exhaustion overpowering her grief, at least temporarily. Dawn brought a chill to the air and renewed determination. They rode steadily northward, keeping to less traveled paths. Mason proved to be a skilled guide, reading the land with an ease that spoke of years in the wilderness. "How far to Fort Bridger?" Dahlia asked, as they stopped to water the horses at a small creek. 5 days if the weather holds. There's a trading post about 2 days ahead where we can resupply. As they continued, Dahlia found herself studying Mason. He was older than her by perhaps 10 years, putting him in his mid-30s. His movements were efficient, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. She noticed a scar that ran along his jaw, disappearing beneath his collar. "Apache," he said, catching her gaze. "10 years back, I was careless." "You fought Indians?" "Fought some, traded with others, learned from most." He adjusted his hat. "They're not the savages people make them out to be, just people protecting their way of life, same as anyone." By midday they had covered significant ground. The landscape was changing, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with pine trees. "We should reach Sheffield Pass by nightfall," Mason said. "Steep going, but it'll save us a day's ride." As they approached the pass, Mason suddenly raised his hand, signaling a halt. He dismounted silently, drawing his rifle. "What is it?" Dahlia whispered, her hand moving to the pistol at her waist. "Tracks, fresh. 4, maybe 5 riders passed through here not long ago." He knelt, examining the ground. Heavy horses moving fast. Could be nothing but... "Holcomb's men?" Fear crept into her voice. "Can't say for sure, but we should be cautious." He remounted. "There's another way around, longer but safer." They diverted their path, taking a game trail that wound through thicker forest. The going was slower, and Dahlia felt a growing sense of unease. Every snapping twig made her jump. "You mentioned you've been running," she said, partly to distract herself. "What from?" Mason was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "A reputation," he finally said. "Made some mistakes in my younger days. Rode with some men I shouldn't have. Got a name I didn't want." "A wanted man?" He shook his head. "Not anymore. Served my time, but names stick in these parts." Night was falling when they reached a suitable campsite, a small clearing sheltered by a rock formation. As Mason tended to the horses, Dahlia gathered firewood. The routine felt strangely comforting after the chaos of the previous day. "You handle yourself well out here," Mason observed as they ate a simple meal of beans and salt pork. "Thomas and I lived rough for years before we built our place. Started with nothing but a tent and determination." Her voice caught. "We were just beginning to prosper." "What will you do now? After Fort Bridger, I mean." Dahlia had been avoiding that question, even in her own mind. "I have a sister in Oregon. Haven't seen her in 6 years, but she'd take me in. I expect." "Oregon's a long way." "Everywhere's a long way from somewhere," she replied. "What about you? Where are you headed after Fort Bridger?" Mason shrugged. "Wherever the trail leads, maybe north to Montana. Heard there's good land there for those willing to work it." They fell into comfortable silence, the crackling fire and distant cry of a coyote, the only sounds. Dahlia found herself studying Mason's profile, illuminated by the firelight. There was something solid about him, dependable in a way that reminded her of Thomas, yet different. The next morning brought heavy clouds and the threat of rain. They packed quickly, hoping to make good distance before the weather turned. By midday, the first drops began to fall. "There's a line shack about 2 miles ahead," Mason said, pulling his slicker tight around his shoulders. "Used by cattle outfits during drives. Should be empty this time of year." The rain was coming down in sheets by the time they reached the small wooden structure. It was crude but sound, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table, and 2 rickety chairs. Mason tended to the horses in the lean-to at the back while Dahlia got a fire going. The warmth was welcome after the cold rain, and they hung their wet clothes near the flames to dry. "Seems we'll be here a while," Mason said, looking through the single window at the worsening storm. "Crossing the next stretch in this weather would be foolish." Dahlia nodded, suddenly aware of their isolation. She'd spent 2 days in this man's company, yet knew little about him beyond what he'd chosen to share. "You said you made mistakes," she said, as they sat before the fire. "What kind?" Mason's expression darkened. "The kind that cost lives." He sighed. "I rode with the Sutton gang for 2 years. We robbed stages, trains. I was young, angry at the world. My father had lost everything in the war, died broken. I blamed everyone." Dahlia's eyes widened. The Sutton gang was notorious even in her remote corner of the territory. "Were you there? For the Clearwater Massacre?" Mason's jaw tightened. "Yes, I didn't pull the trigger, but I was there. Didn't stop it either. 7 people died that day, including a child. His voice was hollow. I turned myself in the next morning, testified against Sutton and the others, served 8 years in Yuma prison. Dahlia absorbed this information, reconciling it with the man before her. That's what you're running from. Your past. Can't outrun what's inside you, he said, but I'm trying to balance the scales, do some good before I'm done. Is that why you stopped to help me? He met her eyes. I stopped because it was right, stayed because... He hesitated. Because I recognized something in you. Strength, purpose. The moment stretched between them, laden with unspoken thoughts. Dahlia looked away first, her cheeks warming. They spent the day in the shack, the rain continuing relentlessly. Mason repaired a loose shutter while Dahlia took inventory of their supplies. They would need to reach the trading post by the following evening. As night fell, the close quarters became more apparent. They laid their bedrolls on opposite sides of the room, but Dahlia was acutely aware of Mason's presence, his steady breathing, the occasional creak of floorboards when he shifted. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something other than grief, a confusing mixture of guilt and longing that kept her awake long into the night. Dawn brought clearing skies and the decision to press on. The rain had swollen the creek they needed to cross, but Mason found a fallen tree that served as a makeshift bridge. He led the horses across one by one, then offered Dahlia his hand as she navigated the slippery trunk. Careful now, he warned as she nearly lost her footing. His grip was firm, steadying her. Thank you, she said, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. She could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the small scar above his right eyebrow. The moment was broken by a distant gunshot. They both dropped instinctively, scanning the tree line. Could be hunters, Mason whispered, drawing his pistol. Or Holcomb's men, Dahlia replied. They wouldn't give up easily. They remained still, listening intently. 2 more shots rang out, closer this time. Mason pointed silently to a dense thicket of pines. They led the horses there, concealing themselves as best they could. Through a gap in the trees, Dahlia spotted them, 4 riders moving methodically along the creek. She recognized the lead man immediately, Sam Durrell, Holcomb's foreman. The same man who had held her arms while another put a bullet in Thomas's chest. Her hand tightened on her pistol, but Mason placed his hand over hers, shaking his head in warning. They were outnumbered and outgunned. For an agonizing hour they remained hidden as the men searched the area. Finally, convinced their quarry had taken another route, the riders moved off to the east. They're not giving up, Dahlia whispered once they were gone. They'll keep looking. Then we need to be smarter, Mason replied. There's a Shoshone settlement about a day's ride northwest. I've traded with them before. They might give us shelter, throw off our trail. Dahlia hesitated. Like most settlers, she'd been raised to fear native tribes. Can they be trusted? More than most white men I've known, Mason said frankly. Chief Washakie is a man of honor. He's kept peace with settlers for years, despite plenty of provocation. They altered course, pushing hard through the day. The terrain grew more rugged, the pine forests thicker. By late afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking a broad valley. Below, a small settlement of lodges stood near a winding river. We'll approach openly, Mason instructed. No sudden movements. Let me do the talking. As they rode down toward the settlement, several warriors emerged, watching their approach warily. Mason raised his hand in greeting, speaking words in a language Dahlia didn't understand. An older man stepped forward. His face was deeply lined, his long hair streaked with gray. He and Mason exchanged words, then clasped forearms in greeting. This is Running Elk, Mason explained to Dahlia. He's a council elder. I told him we seek peaceful passage and shelter for the night. Running Elk studied Dahlia with keen eyes. The woman has known great sorrow, he said in accented English, and great anger. My husband was murdered, Dahlia replied directly. The men who did it pursue us. Running Elk nodded gravely. Then you will stay. The white men do not come here. They fear what they do not understand. They were given a small lodge near the edge of the settlement. Women brought them food, a rich stew of venison and wild roots that Dahlia found surprisingly flavorful. As night fell, drumming began near the center of the camp. Running Elk invited them to join the gathering. Dahlia was hesitant, but Mason encouraged her. "It's an honor to be included," he explained. Around a large fire, members of the tribe had assembled. The drumming was accompanied by singing, haunting melodies that seemed to resonate with the rhythm of the land itself. Dahlia found herself mesmerized by the display. "They're celebrating the return of the hunting parties," Mason explained quietly, "giving thanks for the bounty that will see them through winter." "You understand their ways well," Dahlia observed. "I lived among the Cheyenne for nearly a year after my release from prison. They taught me to see the world differently, to understand that a man is defined by his actions, not his past." A young woman approached, offering them cups of a steaming beverage. Mason thanked her in the native tongue. "Pine needle tea," he explained to Dahlia. "Good for the spirit, they say." The warmth of the fire, the hypnotic rhythm of the drums, and the sense of safety for the first time in days allowed Dahlia to relax slightly. She found herself leaning against Mason's shoulder, exhaustion finally catching up to her. "Perhaps we should return to our lodge," he suggested gently. In the quiet privacy of their temporary shelter, Dahlia finally allowed the tears she'd been holding back to flow freely. Mason sat beside her, offering silent support. "I keep seeing it," she confessed. "Thomas turning to me, the surprise in his eyes when the bullet hit him. He didn't even have time to reach for his gun." "Grief is a journey with no straight path," Mason said softly. "You don't move past it. You learn to carry it differently. Is that what you did with your guilt?" "I'm still learning," he admitted. "Every day." In the dim light, their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them. Recognition of shared pain, of understanding beyond words. Dahlia reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek. Mason caught her hand, holding it against his face for a moment before gently lowering it. "You're vulnerable," he said quietly. "And I won't take advantage of that." Dahlia withdrew, a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude washing over her. "You're a better man than you give yourself credit for, Mason Graves." "Get some rest," he replied. "We have a long ride tomorrow." Morning brought new resolve. Running elk provided them with additional supplies and directions to avoid the main trails. As they prepared to depart, he pulled Mason aside for a private conversation. When Mason returned to Dahlia, his expression was thoughtful. "What did he say?" she asked as they rode away from the settlement. "That sometimes the greatest journeys are those we take without knowing the destination." He glanced at her. "And that healing comes from unexpected sources." They traveled through the day, the landscape growing increasingly beautiful as they ventured deeper into the mountains. Pine forests gave way to meadows filled with wildflowers. Streams ran clear and cold. It was difficult to reconcile such beauty with the violence that had upended Dahlia's life. By late afternoon, they reached the trading post, a sturdy log building surrounded by a few smaller structures. A handful of horses were tethered outside, and smoke rose from the chimney. "Stay close," Mason advised as they approached. "We'll get what we need and move on quickly." The trading post was dimly lit and crowded with goods barrels of flour and sugar, shelves of canned goods, tools hanging from the rafters. A bearded man with a patch over one eye greeted them from behind the counter. "Mason Graves," he said with a gap-toothed grin. "Thought you might be dead by now." "Not for lack of trying, Hank," Mason replied with a smile. "Need supplies for the trail to Fort Bridger." As Hank gathered their requests, the door opened behind them. Dahlia turned to see two men enter, trail worn and heavily armed. Her blood ran cold as she recognized one of them, not from Holcomb's ranch, but from Silver Creek. He'd been in the saloon where Thomas occasionally sold their excess crops. The man's eyes widened in recognition. "Say, ain't you Thomas Reed's wife?" Mason shifted subtly, positioning himself between Dahlia and the newcomers. "Friend of yours?" "Hardly know the lady," the man replied, but his eyes told a different story. "Just surprised to see her so far from home." Dahlia forced herself to appear calm. "Just passing through. My husband's meeting me in Fort Bridger." The man's expression suggested he didn't believe her, but he nodded and moved to the other side of the store. Mason finished their transaction quickly, paying with coins from a small leather pouch. "Let's go," he murmured, casually. They left the trading post and mounted their horses. Dahlia could feel the men's eyes following them as they rode away. "He'll tell Holcomb's men," she said, once they were out of earshot. "I know. We'll leave the trail as soon as we're out of sight. There's a canyon to the west that few know about. Adds a day to our journey, but should throw them off." They rode hard until dusk, then veered off the main path into a dense forest. The going was difficult, with low branches forcing them to dismount and lead the horses for stretches. Finally, they reached a narrow entrance to a canyon barely visible in the fading light. "We'll camp here tonight," Mason decided. Too dangerous to navigate the canyon in darkness. They made a cold camp, unwilling to risk a fire that might be spotted. Huddled beneath a rocky overhang, they shared jerky and hardtack in silence. "If they find us," Dahlia said finally, "I want you to go. This isn't your fight." Mason looked at her with surprise. "That's not how this works. I've already lost my husband to Holcomb. I won't have another death on my conscience." "Another?" Mason raised an eyebrow. Dahlia hesitated, then sighed. "There's something I haven't told you, about why Holcomb wants our land so badly." She drew a deep breath. "There's gold. Not much, but a steady stream in the creek that runs through our property. Thomas discovered it last spring. We kept it secret, but somehow Holcomb found out." Understanding dawned on Mason's face. That explains his persistence. Thomas wanted to use the gold to build a real future, a proper house, maybe children someday. Her voice broke. Now, all it's brought is death. Mason reached out, taking her hand in his. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone, Dahlia. Whatever comes, we face it together." The intensity in his eyes stirred something in her warmth, in a place she thought had gone cold with Thomas's death. Impulsively, she leaned forward, her lips meeting his in a tentative kiss. For a moment he responded, then gently pulled away. "I don't want your gratitude," he said softly. "It's not gratitude I'm offering," she replied. "It's something I thought died with Thomas. Something I never expected to feel again." Mason studied her face in the dim light. "Are you certain?" Instead of answering, she kissed him again. This time, he didn't pull away. Dawn found them still entwined, Dahlia's head resting on Mason's chest. The guilt she had expected to feel was absent, replaced by a sense of rightness that surprised her. "Thomas would want you to find happiness," Mason said, as if reading her thoughts. "Not to wither in grief." "How did you know what I was thinking?" "Because I've been there, watched someone I loved die, and wondered if I had the right to live fully afterward." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "The answer is yes. Life doesn't wait, Dahlia. It moves forward with or without our permission." They packed quickly and entered the canyon. It was narrow at first, the walls rising steeply on either side. Their voices echoed off the stone, making them speak in whispers. As they progressed, the canyon widened into a beautiful valley, untouched by human settlement. "It's magnificent," Dahlia breathed, taking in the lush grass, the clear stream running through the center, and the stands of aspen trees whose leaves shimmered in the morning light. "The Shoshone consider this sacred ground," Mason explained. "They rarely come here except for ceremonies." They followed the stream through the valley, emerging by mid-afternoon onto a high plateau with sweeping views of the surrounding territory. In the distance, mountains rose majestically against the sky. "We should reach Fort Bridger by tomorrow evening," Mason said, as they paused to rest the horses. Dahlia gazed at the vast landscape spread before them. "What happens then?" "That depends on you," Mason replied. "Fort Bridger has a federal marshal. You could report what happened, make a formal complaint against Holcomb." "On what evidence? It would be my word against his, and he has influence." "Or," Mason continued, "we could keep riding, north to Montana, like I mentioned, or west to Oregon to find your sister." The possibilities stretched before her like the landscape daunting but full of potential. "What would you choose?" Mason looked at her thoughtfully. "A month ago, I'd have said keep moving, stay ahead of the past. Now," he took her hand, "now I'm thinking maybe it's time to stop running, to build something. Together?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "If that's what you want." Dahlia thought of the homestead she and Thomas had built, the dreams they'd shared. "I don't know if I can start over again." "You already have," Mason pointed out gently, "the moment you decided to ride away from that burning cabin." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Mason immediately led them to a cluster of boulders that provided cover. From their position, They could see the trail below. 6 riders approached, moving fast. Holcomb's men, with Durrell in the lead. "They must have picked up our trail," Mason muttered, "either at the trading post or from the Shoshone." "The Shoshone wouldn't betray us," Dahlia whispered back. "Not willingly, but Holcomb has ways of making people talk." They watched as the riders passed beneath them, continuing along the main trail toward Fort Bridger. "They think we stayed on the direct route," Mason observed. "We have an advantage now, but it won't last long. Once they reach Fort Bridger and don't find us, they'll double back, start searching the alternative routes." "What do we do?" Mason thought for a moment. "We change the game, stop reacting and start acting." "What do you mean?" "Holcomb wants your land for the gold. What if we take away his reason to pursue you?" Understanding dawned on Dahlia's face. "You mean expose him? Make the gold claim public?" "Exactly. The territorial governor is scheduled to visit Fort Bridger next week. If we can get there, present our case directly to him." "Holcomb would lose his advantage," Dahlia finished. "With official attention on the gold claim, he couldn't simply take it by force." "It's risky," Mason admitted. "We'd be walking straight into the lion's den, but sometimes the boldest move is the safest." They debated the plan as they continued their journey, weighing the dangers against the potential rewards. By nightfall, they had reached a decision. "We'll do it your way," Dahlia said as they made camp. "Confront the situation head on, but first, we need evidence of Holcomb's crimes." "The banker in Silver Creek," Mason suggested. "Would he have records of Holcomb's attempts to acquire your land?" Dahlia nodded slowly. "Mr. Abernathy. He handled the paperwork when Thomas refused Holcomb's offers. He's not a brave man, but he's honest. If approached properly, he might provide documentation." "That's our first step, then. We reach Fort Bridger, then one of us makes a discreet trip to Silver Creek." "I should go," Dahlia said firmly. "Abernathy knows me. It's too dangerous. Holcomb's men will be watching for you there. Which is why they won't expect me to return so boldly. Besides, a woman alone attracts less suspicion than a man in your profession." Mason frowned, but couldn't deny her logic. "We'll decide when we reach Fort Bridger." That night, their lovemaking was more intense, fueled by the uncertainty that lay ahead and the growing depth of their feelings. Afterward, Dahlia traced the scar along Mason's jaw. "If we succeed," she said softly, "what then? Then we have choices, real ones. And if you had to choose now," Mason's eyes were serious in the moonlight that filtered through the trees, "I'd choose a life with you, Dahlia Reed. Whether that's in Montana, Oregon, or somewhere else entirely. Even though we've known each other less than a week, time moves differently out here. A week on the trail tells you more about a person than years in civilization." He brushed his lips against her forehead. "I've seen your courage, your resilience. That's all I need to know." The final day's ride to Fort Bridger was tense, both of them scanning constantly for signs of Holcomb's men. The fort itself came into view by late afternoon, a sprawling compound of buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade. Originally a military outpost, it had evolved into a trading center and way station for travelers heading west. They approached cautiously, circling to enter from the east rather than the main road. Inside the fort, activity buzzed traders, trappers, soldiers, and settlers mingling in the central courtyard. "We need to find lodging where we won't be easily spotted," Mason said, keeping his voice low as they rode through the gates, "and make contact with the marshal." They found accommodation at a small boarding house on the fort's perimeter, run by a widow who asked few questions. After securing their horses, Mason left to locate the marshal while Dahlia remained in their room, watching the street below for familiar faces. He returned an hour later, his expression grim. "Marshal's out on patrol, won't be back for 2 days, and I spotted 2 of Holcomb's men at the saloon across from the trading post." "Did they see you?" "No, but they're clearly watching for us. We need to move carefully." They spent the evening planning. The territorial governor would arrive in 5 days. Until then, they needed to gather evidence and avoid Holcomb's men. "I still think I should go to Silver Creek," Dahlia insisted. Disguised, of course. Mason reluctantly agreed that her plan had merit. 2 days there and back, if all goes well. I'll remain here, establish contact with the marshal when he returns, and prepare our case for the governor." The next morning, Dahlia prepared for her journey. She wore a simple dress borrowed from their landlady, with her hair styled differently and a shawl covering much of her face. Mason had acquired a different horse for her, a placid bay mare that wouldn't attract attention. "Be careful," he said, as they said their goodbyes in the stable. "If anything feels wrong, anything at all, turn back immediately." "I will." She kissed him, lingering a moment. "Wait for me." "Always," he promised. Dahlia rode out of Fort Bridger with a mixture of determination and fear. The journey to Silver Creek would take a full day, and every mile brought her closer to danger. Yet she felt a strength within her that had been absent before, a clarity of purpose that drove her forward. Silver Creek appeared on the horizon as dusk approached the following day. The small town looked peaceful, its buildings painted golden by the setting sun. Dahlia pulled her shawl closer around her face as she rode down the main street. The saloon was busy, laughter and piano music spilling out into the evening air. She avoided it, heading instead for the small bank at the end of the street. Mr. Abernathy lived above his business. Dahlia tied her horse at the rear of the building and knocked on the back door. The banker answered, his spectacles perched on his nose and a book in his hand. "Mrs. Reed," he exclaimed, clearly shocked. "They said you were dead." "Not yet," she replied grimly. "May I come in?" Inside, she explained her situation, while the banker listened with growing alarm. "What you're asking is dangerous," he said when she finished. "Holcomb has eyes everywhere. My husband was murdered, Mr. Abernathy. I'm simply seeking justice." The banker hesitated, then nodded. "I have the records of his offers for your land, and more documents showing similar tactics used against 3 other homesteaders who eventually sold to him under duress. Would that help?" "It would be perfect," Dahlia said, hope rising within her. Abernathy retrieved a folder from a hidden compartment in his desk. "I've kept these separate from official bank records. Always suspected they might be needed someday." "Thank you," Dahlia said, carefully storing the documents in her saddlebag. "You're a brave man." "Hardly," he sighed. "Just tired of watching Holcomb destroy good people. Be careful, Mrs. Reed. He's more dangerous now than ever." Dahlia left Silver Creek before dawn, taking a circuitous route back to Fort Bridger. The documents felt like gold in her possession, tangible proof of Holcomb's corruption and violence. She was a half-day's ride from the fort when disaster struck. Rounding a bend in the trail, she found herself face to face with Sam Durrell and 2 other men from Holcomb's ranch. "Well, look what we have here," Durrell drawled, his hand moving to his pistol. "The widow Reed, back from the dead." Dahlia wheeled her horse. But the other men had already moved to block her escape. She was trapped. "Mr. Holcomb will be mighty pleased to see you," Durrell continued, moving his horse closer. "He's been real concerned about your welfare." "I'm sure," Dahlia replied, her mind racing. The documents were hidden in her saddlebag, but if they took her back to Holcomb, they would certainly find them. "Where's that cowboy you've been riding with?" one of the other men asked. "I don't know what you're talking about," Dahlia replied evenly. "I've been traveling alone." Durrell laughed. "Sure you have. Let's go, Mrs. Reed. Mr. Holcomb is waiting." As they moved to surround her, Dahlia made a desperate decision. She kicked her horse hard, charging directly at Durrell. The sudden movement startled him, giving her just enough space to break past. Gunshots rang out behind her as she galloped down the trail. A burning pain ripped through her shoulder, but she kept riding, pushing the mare to her limits. She could hear hoofbeats in pursuit, gradually falling behind as her lighter mount outpaced their heavier horses. By the time she reached Fort Bridger, blood had soaked through her dress and her vision was blurring. She rode straight to the boarding house, nearly falling from her horse as Mason ran out to meet her. "Dahlia, what happened?" "Durrell," she gasped as he helped her down. "They found me on the trail, but I got the documents." Mason carried her inside, calling urgently for the landlady to fetch a doctor. The wound in Dahlia's shoulder was serious, but had missed vital areas. The fort surgeon removed the bullet and bandaged her, prescribing strict rest. "They'll be coming," Dahlia said weakly as Mason sat beside her bed. "Durrell and the others. They'll know I came here." "The marshal returned this morning," Mason replied, squeezing her hand. "I've already spoken with him. He has men watching the approaches to the fort." Dahlia insisted on showing him the documents despite her condition. Mason examined them carefully. his expression growing more determined with each page. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. "Abernathy has documented everything, the threats, the pattern of intimidation. Combined with your testimony, it's enough to bring Holcomb down." "If the governor believes us," Dahlia murmured, fatigue overtaking her. "He will," Mason assured her. "Rest now. I'll stay with you." Dahlia drifted into uneasy sleep, waking occasionally to find Mason still at her side, sometimes reading the documents, sometimes simply watching over her. By morning, her fever had broken, and she felt stronger. "The governor arrives tomorrow," Mason told her as he helped her sit up. "The marshal has agreed to arrange a private meeting." "And Holcomb?" "No sign yet, but the marshal has doubled the guards at the fort's entrance. If Holcomb or his men try to enter, they'll be spotted." But Dahlia knew better than to underestimate Victor Holcomb. "He won't give up easily, not with so much at stake." "Neither will we," Mason replied firmly. The next day brought news that the governor's party had been sighted approaching the fort. Dahlia was still weak, but insisted on being present for the meeting. Dressed in clean clothes borrowed from the landlady, with her arm in a sling, she looked pale but determined. The marshal escorted them to his office, where Governor Harrison would meet them privately before the official reception. As they waited, Dahlia felt a strange calm descend upon her. Whatever happened now, she had done everything possible to seek justice for Thomas. The governor arrived, a distinguished man with silver hair and a commanding presence. The marshal made brief introductions, then left them to speak privately. "I understand you have a serious matter to discuss," Governor Harrison said, taking a seat behind the marshal's desk. "Something concerning Victor Holcomb?" "Yes, sir," Mason replied, placing the folder of documents before him. Evidence of a pattern of intimidation, violence, and murder aimed at acquiring land with gold deposits. As the governor reviewed the documents, his expression grew increasingly grave. Dahlia recounted her story, Thomas's refusal to sell, the attack on their homestead, his murder, and her subsequent flight. "These are serious allegations," the governor said when she finished. "Holcomb is an influential man in this territory." "With all due respect, Governor," Mason interjected, "influence shouldn't place anyone above the law." Harrison nodded slowly. "You're quite right, Mr. Graves, and these documents are compelling." He looked directly at Dahlia. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Reed. It appears you've been wronged terribly." "Will you help us?" Dahlia asked simply. "I will. I'll instruct the territorial prosecutor to prepare charges immediately. Holcomb will be arrested and brought to trial." Relief washed over Dahlia, so intense she nearly swayed in her chair. Mason steadied her with a gentle hand on her good shoulder. "Thank you, Governor," she said, her voice thick with emotion. As they left the marshal's office, Dahlia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "It's really happening," she said to Mason as they crossed the fort's courtyard. "Thomas will have justice." "Yes," Mason agreed, "and you'll have a future." They were halfway back to the boarding house when shouts erupted near the fort's entrance. Gunfire followed, sending people scrambling for cover. Through the chaos, Dahlia spotted him, Victor Holcomb himself, flanked by Durrell and several armed men, pushing through the gates despite the guards' attempts to stop them. "Get inside," Mason urged, pulling Dahlia toward the nearest building, the trading post. They barely made it through the door when Holcomb's voice rang out across the courtyard. "Dahlia Reed, show yourself." Mason positioned Dahlia behind a stack of crates, then moved to the window, peering cautiously outside. "The marshal's men are responding, but they're outnumbered." "He knows he's finished," Dahlia said. "The governor, the documents, he's desperate." "Which makes him more dangerous," Mason replied grimly, checking his pistol. "Stay here." "Mason, no." But he was already moving toward the door. "I'll draw them away from the building. When it's clear, go straight to the marshal's office. The governor is still there." Before she could protest further, he was gone. Dahlia watched through the window as Mason emerged, calling out to Holcomb. "She's not your concern anymore, Holcomb. Your real problem is the governor and the evidence against you." Holcomb wheeled toward Mason, his face contorted with rage. "The cowboy who's been helping her. Durrell told me about you." "It's over, Holcomb," Mason continued, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "The governor has the evidence. Charges are being filed as we speak." "Then I have nothing to lose," Holcomb snarled, drawing his pistol. Gunfire erupted, Mason diving behind a water trough, as bullets splintered the wood around him. He returned fire, hitting one of Holcomb's men in the shoulder. Dahlia couldn't stay hidden. Not again. Not while someone she cared for was in danger. Ignoring the pain in her shoulder, she moved to the trading post's counter where the owner kept a shotgun. Checking that it was loaded, she took a deep breath and slipped out the side door. Moving along the edge of the buildings, she positioned herself with a clear view of Holcomb, who was focused entirely on Mason. Durrell spotted her first, shouting a warning, but it was too late. "Drop your weapons!" Dahlia commanded, the shotgun steady in her hands despite her injury. "All of you!" Holcomb turned, his eyes widening when he saw her. "Mrs. Reed, the woman of the hour." "It's over, Holcomb," she said firmly. "The governor knows everything." "Then I'll make sure you don't live to testify," he replied, swinging his pistol toward her. Two shots rang out simultaneously, Holcomb's and Mason's. Holcomb's bullet whizzed past Dahlia's ear, but Mason's found its mark. Victor Holcomb staggered, a look of surprise on his face, then collapsed to the ground. The remaining men, seeing their employer fall, quickly surrendered as the marshal and his deputies arrived in force. Mason rushed to Dahlia's side, gently taking the shotgun from her hands. "Are you all right?" She nodded, shaking slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "Is he?" "Dead," Mason confirmed, "and Durrell will face trial along with the others." The marshal approached them, his expression a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen, both of you. But it worked." Governor Harrison had witnessed the confrontation from the safety of the marshal's office. He joined them as Holcomb's men were being led away. "It seems I've underestimated Holcomb's desperation," he said gravely. "And your courage, Mrs. Reed." "What happens now?" Dahlia asked. "Justice," the governor replied simply. "And as for your land claim with the gold deposit now public knowledge, I'll ensure it's properly registered in your name. No one will be able to take it from you again." 2 weeks later, Dahlia stood on the porch of a small cabin in Montana Territory. Behind her, Mason was unloading supplies from their wagon. The mountain vista before them was breathtaking, endless forests, snow-capped peaks, and a clear river winding through the valley below. "What do you think?" Mason asked, joining her at the railing. "It's beautiful," she replied honestly. "More beautiful than I imagined?" After the confrontation at Fort Bridger, they had made their decision. The homestead in Silver Creek held too many painful memories for Dahlia. Instead, they had traveled north to Montana, using part of Dahlia's savings to purchase this small claim from a miner returning east. "It needs work," Mason acknowledged, looking at the rough cabin. "But it's a start." "A new start," Dahlia agreed, turning to face him. "For both of us." Mason took her hands in his. "Are you sure about this? About us?" "I can't go back there," she said softly, echoing the words she'd spoken when they first met. "To the past, to the grief, to who I was before." "Then we'll ride forward instead," Mason replied, smiling as he repeated his own words from that fateful day. Together. Dahlia leaned into his embrace, feeling for the first time in months a sense of genuine hope. The journey hadn't ended. In many ways, it was just beginning. But now she had a companion for the trail ahead, someone who understood both loss and redemption. As the sun set over their new home, casting golden light across the porch where they stood, Dahlia knew that while the road forward might not always be easy, it would be traveled together, and that made all the difference.